Good morning to our viewers here in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. The protests that took place throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa some 10 years ago as people fought against oppressive governments were dubbed the Arab Spring. Although many observers and analysts at the time believed that this would be a turning point for the region, high hopes have turned to despair. A decade after citizens throughout the region rose up against its dictators, authoritarianism still has a tight grip and people are exhausted and drained. Poverty has deepened, and the pandemic, as well as falling oil prices, have exacerbated an already difficult situation. I'm joined today by former US diplomat Ambassador James F. Jeffrey and award-winning German journalist Souad Mekhennet to reflect on the events 10 years ago and to talk about the situation in the region today. But before I invite them to comment, let me take us back in time. In January 2011, the authoritarian regime of Tunisia's president was toppled by protests triggered by the self-immolation of a street vendor weeks earlier. It was a quick and relatively peaceful revolution coming after decades of stagnant but entrenched regimes throughout the Arab world. Within days, tens of thousands of Egyptians had flooded Cairo's Tahrir Square and forced Hosni Mubarak from power. And within weeks, other significant protest movements emerged. And by the middle of 2011, leaders throughout the region were under serious pressure or had been swept away by a tidal wave of peaceful demonstrations and armed resistance. The promise and potential of a nascent movement had become a true phenomenon. And at the time, many experts and observers had high hopes, but today, those hopes have not been fulfilled. Instead, the phrase Arab Spring has become synonymous with shattered dreams. Only the Tunisian revolution remains intact. Every other country affected has either collapsed into chaos and civil war, like Libya and Syria, or entered a new era of dictatorship, like Egypt. Ambassador James Jeffrey spent much of his career as a diplomat focused on the Middle East. In December, he joined the Wilson Center as the chair of the Middle East program. Jim, in 2011, you were US ambassador to Iraq. When you think back to the events of late 2010 and early 2011, how did you think things might play out for the region?
Thank you, Steve, and thanks for inviting me on with Souad today. The nature of being ambassador in Iraq, particularly in 2011, is such that your world is primarily focused only on Iraq because Iraq was such a fragile project. One of the phenomena of the Arab Spring was that excluding places where the uprisings occurred before, I'm thinking of 2009 in Iran, or afterwards, I'm thinking of the protests in Lebanon in recent years. You have seen uprisings of one or another sort almost everywhere in the Arab world, except the tightly maintained, and particularly in 2011, relatively economically well-off Gulf oil royal states, and with the exception, of course, of Bahrain that I'll get to. The main focus, thus, of the Arab Spring in Iraq was what was happening in Iraq. There were a set of major protests in Baghdad and in the south of the country. They did not last very long, but they were characterized by two things. One is the Al-Qaeda in Iraq elements used the opportunity to run amok in various areas, including destroying the Beirut refinery, which was a very big step in the wrong direction and of great concern to us. And then considerable government repression, which also troubled us because we knew in Baghdad many of the people who were protesting, they were part of the educated elite with whom we'd had good contacts before and after 2003. Many of them were out on the street, many Sunni Arabs, but most of the violence occurred in the south. So we were concerned about that because of both the stability of the Maliki government and the reputation of the Maliki government. We didn't want it to fall, but we didn't want it to slaughter a lot of people and further disillusion the American people and the West generally on Iraq. So we were focused on that. There's 1,000 little things you do at an embassy to try to help things, from getting in. I forget which major American company had done the Beiji refinery in the 1950s, but getting in experts to start fixing it, to telling Maliki to tone down the violence. There were other aspects of it. One, very quickly, one of the areas, the Libyan uprising, led, of course, to a civil war and then to an Arab mobilization. We had to work on overflights for, I think, both Qatari and Emirati aircraft to fly to support the NATO mission. And that was interesting. The other thing that was of some concern was the uprising in Bahrain, because the Bahraini uprising was almost entirely of the Shia majority. It was ruthlessly suppressed, not just by the Bahraini government, but by the GCC, led by the Saudis. This put the Shia community, the majority ethnic religious community in Iraq, under pressure, beginning with its religious leader, Grand Ayatollah Sistani. And so we were urging Washington to at least remain neutral, which Washington basically did on the Bahrain uprising. As I said, it was put down, and Washington, in fact, with some urging from us, was fairly critical. I would say that was the longest term focus that we had, because Sistani made it clear through intermediaries to us that he expected the United States to stand up for majority rights and religious rights, all of which were being tread underfoot by the Saudis and Bahraini government. So that was a focus. Now, more generally, in the moments I had to think about this, having spent many years in the Middle East, beginning with, as a soldier, put on alert to go to the Sinai in the Yom Kippur War in 1974, and then 2 years in Tunisia. So as this all began in Tunisia, I was interested. My feeling was, wouldn't it be nice if we finally saw a change? We all knew that compared to the other areas we dealt with in the Cold War and afterwards, Europe, Asia, Central and South America, this region never recovered from instability. East Asia went through, from 1945 to 1972, almost 3 decades of communist and internal conflicts and crises, and finally it calmed with few changes for the succeeding 40 years. Now it's different, but we got 40 years of peace. Same thing with Central America after the 1980s. Same thing, obviously, with Europe after the Second Berlin crisis. Things calmed down. You still had competition, conflicts, but you didn't have this sort of crazy turmoil. I've a few times inventoried the waves of total collapse, 74, 79 in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, the Soviets marching into Afghanistan. And then you had a period of response, things quieted. Then you had Saddam invading Kuwait, and another cycle. And you go through these cycles. So we were hoping that these cycles would be broken, but we were skeptical. And my reference, and I'll finish now, is the UNDP study on the Arab world from 2002, which painted a grim picture of a world, and this could extend to Afghanistan and Pakistan, with limited identification with the state, limited loyalties to the state, really major sociological, economic, women's issues, intellectual, and other entrepreneurial and other problems that even areas like Africa were beginning to cope with, and the Middle East wasn't. So I was hopeful, but I was not particularly sure that anything would come of it. I didn't think it would turn out as badly as it did.
Thanks, Jim. Let me bring Souad Mekhennet into the conversation. Souad is an award-winning reporter for the Washington Post's National Security Desk and the author of a critically acclaimed memoir titled "I Was Told to Come Alone: My Journey Behind the Lines of Jihad." Souad, Jim just said, from his standpoint, it would have been nice to see a change. It would have been nice to see greater stability in the region, but that he had some skepticism about how things would play out. Souad, you were actually on the ground in Egypt and elsewhere during the early months of 2011. And I remember from some of our conversations at the time that you were much more skeptical than many other observers about how things might unfold and what the lasting implications of these protests and uprisings might be. And you even anticipated greater instability for the region. Can you talk a little bit about why you were so skeptical about the Arab Spring?
First of all, thank you very much, Steve, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with Jim on this panel. So I would maybe step back a little bit and talk, and explain people a little bit of my own background. So I've covered national security and terrorism since the 9/11 attacks in 2001. And it's very important because I have actually spoken and engaged with different actors and players in the Middle East, but also, for example, in Europe, who were members of radical groups, of extremist groups, and of course also with politicians and different kind of analysts. Now, this brings us back to 2011. When in 2011, the uprising started, as you mentioned, I was on the ground in Egypt. I was actually also imprisoned in Egypt at some stage, but that's a different story. But I started when I saw the people protesting. I began to talk to people there and ask them, why are you here? And yes, there were indeed a few who said, we are here to protest for human rights. We are here to protest because our regime is corrupt. But then you had others there who said, I want better healthcare. I want a strong leader like Gaddafi. So suddenly I realized, wait a second, not everyone who's on the streets here is protesting for the values, the democratic values that we would hold so that are so important to us, people who live in the West. That was one episode where I started to begin to think, wait a second, there is a discrepancy between what we sometimes describe as here are all of those people demonstrating for democracy. But the other issue, Steve, was also that, and you mentioned I was in different countries. I was in Egypt, I was in Tunisia, I was in Libya, I was in Bahrain, I was in Morocco, in Syria. Democracy, I felt, when people said, yes, we are here to protest for democracy, and I asked them, what exactly do you mean by that? You were surprised what kind of answers you had. In some cases, it was majority rule over minority rule, for example, in the case of Bahrain. In other cases, it was, well, we want actually some kind of like an Islamist rulership, because then at some stage in Egypt, you had the Muslim Brotherhood engaging also. And this is where so when I was on the ground and I had those kind of interviews, I began to wonder, why is it that I am seeing these things? And I wrote about this, and I wrote about this also in my book. But many of my colleagues didn't, they had a different, how can I say this? They got different stories into the papers. They got different ideas into the papers. And then I started to realize that very often people who do not speak the language, I speak different dialects of Arabic because of my background. My dad is of Moroccan descent. My mom is of Turkish Syrian descent. So I can move around the Middle East and speak the different dialects in North Africa and in the Gulf states or the Middle East. And so very often Western journalists, when they went parachuted sometimes into those countries, they had fixers or translators who were actually members of one group or the other. So, and they didn't realize very often that what they got presented was one side. And unfortunately, also very often, when we underestimated this, that certain groups understood what were the kinds of words we would love to hear. Democracy, right? When people tell you, we are here to protest because we want democracy, that sounds wonderful. As Jim just said, people were hoping in the West, is there hope for the region to change? But so that was one of the reasons why I was skeptical. But the other point, and now we are getting back to the experience I have covering extremist groups, I began to see, after a few weeks after the protest started in Syria, in Libya, in Egypt, that people who were radicalized in Europe, there were a few characters I've written about in my books, started telling me, you know what, we are actually planning trips, we are planning to do hijra, we are planning to leave Europe and to go to those countries because there is a gap, there's a vacuum right now. And all those characters became members of what then became ISIS. And when I saw these kind of movements in an early stage, I began to, and I've written about this, I said, okay, there's a problem here because we have people who are members or sympathizers with Al-Qaeda because ISIS didn't exist. And they got radicalized in Europe, and they are all planning to go to the Middle Eastern regions, to Libya, to Egypt, and then Syria. But it wasn't very, I don't think that a lot of people had realized that this was going on, or if they had realized it, it was at least not what you could hear very often in the media. So, and this is why I was a bit skeptical, and I've written about this, and unfortunately, we did see what happened in Syria. What Libya is, as Jim mentioned, is a total disaster. But there's something else, Steve, which people should not underestimate. At the moment, there are other powers in the region who are taking over. And we have Turkey, we have Russia. Since Jim mentioned also the role of the United States in the region, I have, in my interviews throughout the region, a lot of people actually said, you know what, the US is no longer actually an ally we trust, because the moment our countries are in distress, they drop us. And we see the Russians are actually stood by Assad. So there's another problem the US is facing at the moment.
Souad, thank you, because you have actually anticipated a couple of topics that I wanted to pick up in the course of our conversation. And I'd like to actually go back to Jim for a second, because before joining the Wilson Center, Jim served as the Secretary of State's Special Representative for Syria Engagement and the Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. And so, Jim, I guess, since Souad brought up the role of ISIS more recently and the issue around radicalization, going back as long as 10, even 20 years ago, I think it would be very interesting for us to hear about sort of some of your work in trying to defeat ISIS and where that sort of battle stands now.
I take a bigger view, because terrorism, be it Al-Qaeda, be it ISIS, and to some degree, although it's far more directed and far more organized, terror as used by Iran and its offshoots is one manifestation of this long-term instability and lack of governance, lack of loyalty of the population of the Arab world, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. It's interesting that the three countries in the region that I would say are the closest to nation states, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, have not really participated very much in the wave of terrorism throughout the region. Now, Iran organizes and supports terrorist activities by Hezbollah and other groups, but it is not a country that we associate with terrorism. Obviously, Israel isn't. Even in the West Bank, there were, other than the Hamas people who have a long history, there wasn't a particularly large upsurge in terror over that period. And Turkey, there are relatively few Turkish terrorists, even though it's a Sunni Arab country. There is the PKK, but that's more of an ethnic insurgency that at times uses than terrorism as we see. So these countries that had very weak state systems, bad governance, lack of loyalty, were breeding grounds for terrorist movements as reactions to, you name it, secular governments. In the case of ISIS, ISIS basically was a creation of the Iranians and the Iranians' two minions in Iraq and Syria, Maliki in Baghdad and Assad in Damascus. You had 25 million Sunni Arabs between those two capitals who were being governed by a Shia Muslim in Baghdad and a offshoot of Shia Islam, the Alawite leader Assad in Syria, in Damascus. And these sectarian things matter in the Middle East. And they were both under pressure by Iran to expand its influence. They certainly, neither Maliki nor Assad were particularly had any particular problem with Iran's expansion, but the Sunni Arab populations did. And so that was another trigger for this. So I'd say that, and thus the United States approach under Bush 43 and then under Obama was, we need fundamental, deep change in the region, promoted and led by the United States, either militarily or diplomatically. Bush favored military action, Obama diplomatic, but both of them were absolutely focused on the moment has come. We need to seize the opportunity, in Bush's case that came from 9/11, in Obama's case that came from the Arab Spring of 2011, to basically from the outside and from the bottom up, change these societies to be like Denmark. And they both failed badly. And this failure has had an impact on the late Obama and the Trump administrations, and it is the going in position of the Biden administration that we're dealing with right now, which is we need to pivot away from the region. It's absorbed too many resources. Nothing has worked. And that's where we are now after the disappointments of the Arab Spring and the surge of terrorism that came from it. Of course, we have major terrorist movements, obviously emanating from Syria, most importantly ISIS, but not just ISIS. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is another one that is a Al-Qaeda offshoot that wants to perhaps become an opposition military force. We have the ISIS elements in the Sinai, an offshoot of the Arab Spring. We have terrorist elements, obviously in Yemen, obviously in Libya, and the region is less stable now than it was in 2011, and that's something that, despite all of the efforts the United States has put into it, with the bulk of the West in most of the governments of the region behind it since 9/11. And I think that you see this fatigue very much in the behavior of the Biden administration.
Souad, I'm sure that there are some things there that you would like to respond to, and I'd like to invite you to do that. But I'd also like you to pick up on this point of other actors in the region who have been interfering with some of the developments, like Russia, Turkey, and others. And that's something then that I'd like to come back to you, Jim, and ask about as well. But Souad, let me give you the floor to respond to what Jim was just saying.
Thank you so much. I would just, respectfully disagree on a few points Jim made when it comes to radicalization. If you look at, we are now in the 20th year, 20 years after 9/11, and we spoke about the so-called Hamburg Cell. We had a few men who traveled from Arab countries to study in Germany and who got radicalized in Germany and who they didn't come as sleepers as we described it in the early stage and waited there for their mission. They were radicalized in Germany. And trust me, I know because I interviewed the man who radicalized them in Germany. So that's number one. So I think a little bit to paint this as terrorism is just, we are dealing with ISIS and Al-Qaeda because, or radicalization, because it's a problem in the Middle East. It's not just a problem in the Middle East. It's a little bit more complicated. It has to do also with the opportunities of people to just open up mosques in Europe for many many years without anybody caring or checking what was actually taught in those mosques. So that's just one point I would like to make, because it's also important to remember the people who committed the Paris attacks were all people who grew up most of their lives in France or in Belgium. So those weren't people, there were two characters who had been Syrians who were radicalized in Syria, but all the other members of the cell were actually people who were either born or grew up most of their lives in Europe. So we have an issue in the West as well that we have to deal with, and we cannot just say the problem is the region. The problem is that ISIS, Jim, some people would even argue that ISIS, the leadership of ISIS got radicalized in some of the prisons when they were in Iraq, in Camp Bucca and others. I don't have to tell you this, but there's a clear sense that, for example, al-Baghdadi, who was there, got radicalized got even more radical while he was in prison. And it had a lot to do with also the behavior of Shia militias who were backed by Iran. So it's a little bit more complicated and complex, and it's sad. Now, coming to the role of Turkey and Iran, the number 3 person of Al-Qaeda was for many years hosted in Iran. And we know that a lot of Al-Qaeda figures actually were under so-called house arrest, but were able to move back and forth from and in Iran. So I would urge a little bit also caution to describe Iran as a country that did not use those kind of extremist groups for their own interests. The role of Turkey, now, it is unfortunately a fact, and I've written about this too, and other colleagues did, that a lot of the people who traveled from abroad and who tried to join ISIS actually crossed the border into Syria via Turkey. And there were actually ISIS recruiters who waited for them at the southern border, Antakya, and then crossed them into guest houses where they were, and then started the training with them. So there are a lot of, of course, a lot of people have their own interests and a lot of countries had their own interests in order to keep Syria as a battleground. And we see the same now with Libya. In Libya, believe it or not, Steve, you have at the moment, you have on one hand, the Russians supporting General Haftar, and you have Turkey supporting the government that is at the moment in Libya, both fighting on one hand or the other to also get their hands on oil business, but it's a bit more. Turkey is supporting a government which is seen in the eyes of Egypt and the United Arab Emirates as supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so they are backed by Turkey and by Qatar. And on the other hand, you have Russia, the UAE, and to a certain extent Jordan and Egypt supporting Haftar, and so. We are seeing it's not just a question of what happened with the Arab Spring at the moment. It's also the question of what's the role of the United States of America in all of this. And yes, if Jim said people seem to be tired of the region, but then we also do not have to be surprised that at some stage you have those players like Turkey, Russia, and China who will take over. And who are, by the way, and it's a decision the administration will have to make, because it will also have implications on the economy in the United States and other things. But of course, this is at the moment the reality on the ground. And Iran has as Jim described, was able to also implement their interests in Syria. They became more powerful. Shia militias in Iraq are almost more powerful than the Iraqi army. It's so the reality on the ground is that, yes, while we were all hoping for a positive, optimistic change in the region, the fact is it is not positive. And I guess we are at the moment in a situation where we may see as a next step, and God help us if that happens, that Al-Qaeda and ISIS might merge, and that the region becomes even more of a breeding ground for terrorism. And we should not forget, and these are the lessons we've seen when the Paris attacks happened. it's very easy for people to slip through borders and to get back to Europe. So these are all implications I believe we have to have in mind.
So, Jim, I mean, I think that's a good segue to come back to U.S. policy on the region, particularly with the new administration. And one of the pieces that I read yesterday in Politico said in no uncertain terms that the Middle East is not in the top 3 priorities of the Biden administration. It's more of a focus on the Asia Pacific, on Europe, on the Western Hemisphere. And I guess one official was quoted as saying that this administration is being quote extremely purposeful not to get dragged into the Middle East. So what are your thoughts on the U.S. role in the region at this critical juncture?
The reports are correct that the Biden administration, it's both not just a disillusionment with what we've tried in the Middle East, particularly under the early Obama and Bush 43 administrations. It's also the pressing nature of the threats from both natural events, COVID and climate, and the near-peer competition of Russia and China. This is only beginning to sink into the minds of the people who left government in 2016. Trump came in, whatever his other flaws, focused on, quote, near-peer competition. He also tried to, of course, pivot out of the Middle East and spent a whole lot of time involved in there, including several crises in Syria, pulling out of the JCPOA and other things. The administration has all the best intentions. It's going to be hard to do this for several reasons. First of all, even if we argue that as we are energy independent today and probably not vulnerable to a second 9/11, we are absolutely involved in a larger degree of global competition and threat than we have been since 1989. And both necessity and the intention of the Biden administration is to work with our partners and allies, the really important ones. They're mainly in East Asia and Europe. Unlike us, they are very vulnerable to things from the Middle East. First of all, they are, all of them, plus China, are dependent upon oil and to some degree gas from the Middle East. And if it's cut off as it was in 1974, again in 1979, 1980, briefly in 1990, 1991, you have very significant economic impact in those countries and in the global economy, which indirectly affects us. Secondly, as Souad pointed out, those areas, particularly Western Europe, are much more vulnerable to other manifestations. The year 2015 was a double whammy of terrorist attacks beginning in Paris and Cannes, eventually spreading to Brussels and to Berlin, as well as a refugee flow, both of them coming just from one crisis, Syria, largely from Syria. And that has an impact on us as it impacts dramatically what happened in Europe and what's happened to Europe since. I couldn't have a conversation with a European on any Middle Eastern subject without the problems of migration, the role of Turkey as both a fueler and a defender of the system, and the fear of new terrorist attacks coming into the center of the discussion. The second thing is, I'm a believer in the indivisibility of a global collective security system. That's what the United States has been running since 1940. There are many indications of this. In fact, as this is the American Council on Germany, one of the major reasons why Germany, much inclined to pacifism after World War II, in the end joined NATO was because 8,000 miles away, they watched the United States, the main country they had to count on to come to its defense, who hadn't done anything after World War I, of course, send 350,000 troops to Korea, and 35,000 troops died, defending terrain that the Germans knew was a hell of a lot less important than Berlin and the Ruhr and therefore figured that America could be counted on. That's the problem in reverse. If you let, in an area that is certainly important to the Europeans and to some degree to our East Asian partners, go to hell in a handbasket, and it has a tendency to do that without a very big effort from all of us, then the overall Biden program of dealing with near-peer competitors, dealing with global issues, and reestablishing all of our good relationships around the world are going to be put under pressure because we're not acting in the Middle East. When Macron gets up there and says, hey, don't do the JCPOA without talking to the Israelis and the Saudis, that's an early warning that they're not too happy in Europe about this American attitude.
That's a perfect segue to a viewer question that I'd like to pose to each of you. One of our viewers is curious as to what action the United States and Europe might take together to calm down the situation in the Middle East and potentially help transition to greater stability.
Do you want to answer the question first?
Souad, I just
Whoever
spoke. Why don't you start? It's a European question.
Why don't you go ahead?
So I believe it is always, it's always important to understand that when we, and I grew up in Germany, I was born there, I work for an American newspaper, but when we go into countries that have a totally different social structure. For example, in Libya, people underestimated how powerful still the tribal system was after the fall of Gaddafi, and which is one of the reasons why it became such a disaster, because different tribes started to have different kind of interests with, aligned themselves with different political groups or countries. But I think point number one would be to speak more with people in the region as well and engage with them, trying to give them the feeling that it's not just one country or it's not just the West making a decision for them. So now we're coming to the nuclear deal, actually. I think it is important to give people, in order to create a deal that will bring stability and has a chance to survive for a longer period of time, it would be important to engage with the different players, with the countries, the neighboring countries of Iran, or the countries that had, for example, faced certain security issues with Iran or had been in conflict, to engage with them, to give them also the feeling that it's not just a group of countries that actually are not even in the region and are not even neighboring countries to Iran are making the decisions for them. And I think I would say that if we talk now also about the Middle East and the rest of the Middle East, it's really, we cannot solve the issue if we do not bring all the different parties together and speak to them. And there have to be solutions for the countries. And it's not about what we think would be the best, because if people in the region have the feeling that an outsider is making the decision for them again, it's very likely not, any kind of deal is very likely not to survive for very long, unfortunately. So I would say it's a bit it needs diplomats, or it needs people, maybe even not diplomats, but people who are respected by all the different sides, who understand not only the language, but the cultural background, to be the in-between person, to go and try and calm the situation down. Otherwise, I'm afraid we will see more escalation there.
Thank you, Souad. Jim, particularly in light of your plaidoyer for greater collaboration and the multilateral framework, do you have any thoughts on what action the U.S. and Europe can take together to try to improve the situation in the Middle East?
Sure. Some of my irritation at the folks in the Biden administration, all of whom I worked with very closely, beginning with then Vice President Biden when I was in the Obama administration, comes from this constant, we're back at the table, we're going to do diplomacy, we're going to work with allies and partners. And I say, wait a second, I did that every day in both of my jobs as the coordinator for the coalition against ISIS and on the Syrian account. And with no one more than with the Europeans. They were our partners in the coalition, providing now more troops in Iraq than we have, and more troops in Afghanistan than we have. And also on Syria, the European Union sanctions against the Assad regime complement ours, and in some respects, particularly domestic criminal cases against war crimes, Europe is ahead of us on the Syria account. So we had close relations. That needs to continue, but it has to continue if it only continues if we are sensitive to Europe's security concerns. It doesn't matter that we're energy independent, Europe is not. It doesn't matter that we probably can fend off terrorism, both coming to us and even within the United States better than Europe. Europe, as Souad said, still has problems, and we need to be sensitive to that. Thirdly, I agree that you have to talk with everybody. And in my diplomatic career, in and out of government, I've met with Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, several times. I had a channel open to Qasem Soleimani that was almost literally blown up because of the Cafe Milano incident in 2011. And of course, in Iraq in 2004 and 5, I was one of the people reaching out to at least part of the Sunni resistance. But talking has to be realistic. The problem when Americans start talking, and President Obama is the poster child for this with Iran, is we think that if we just talk to people and show them some faith and some trust, all of which is important and good, they will then think like us and realize that our worldview, the worldview of Hollywood and Silicon Valley and Disneyland, is what they want too, and therefore check that box, mission accomplished. No, there are real reasons. I respected Qasem Soleimani. I popped champagne the day he was taken out. The guy put a rocket into my house once. But that guy believed in what he was doing, and he was brilliant at it. Those are the people we're dealing with. You have to talk with them. You have to try to understand them. You have to try to do compromises with them. In a way, Iran, as Souad said, is a good example. There are fundamental, even though there's some ideological, theological links between Iranian Vilayat-e-Faqih thinking and Al-Qaeda thinking, they are in many respects enemies, but they're able to deal with each other for mutual advantage, which is to make life miserable for the United States and its partners and friends. And that's the kind of realism we need to bring to this. Of course, talk to everybody, but talk to them realizing these are people with different objectives, possibly ready for conflict, and don't expect that just because we talk to them, they're going to become like us. So with that caveat, of course.
But I guess what I'm hearing from both of you is not to underestimate the importance of dialogue and engagement, and not to shy away from that.
Right, but again, I'm an American. I live in the American culture. I have worked closely in the White House for a president, George W., who said, I don't do base runs, I do home runs. Sorry for the baseball analogy, but that's how Americans think. And even though it's a different world, they are obsessed. We're obsessed with our omnipotence. We're obsessed with our power, as Madeleine Albright said, the inalienable superpower. And thus we think that if we just put our minds to it and our shoulders to the wheel and talk to people, they will come around to our position. It ain't that easy. So I kind of shiver, even though as a diplomat, I believe in talking and dialogue. I shiver because the implication, you leap forward when Americans go down that road. Yeah, let's do more diplomacy. We hear that every day from the Biden administration. What they're saying is, let's do more accommodation, because diplomacy you can use. Hitler used diplomacy, Stalin used diplomacy. It's a tool, it's not a strategy. A strategy is accommodation, and that's a mistake.
Yeah, I think just to answer this, what Jim said is a little bit what I was trying to explain. If you send someone to the region who grew up with, in just Europe or the United States, when and has this idealism of, okay, this is the world we live in, we believe this is the ideal world, and goes with that mindset and speaks to people in the Middle East, very often, you you miss a few points that are very important not to miss. And we need to, I think what is important is that you have people who can engage with people in different cultures, who will also understand the sensitivities there, but also understand how they can speak to them in the way that they can make clear certain points are non-negotiable, for example, when it comes to certain human rights, when it comes to women's rights and other things, but without actually giving the other side the feeling that you are telling them what to do. So it's, and for that, I think you need, there are people who understand the different cultures, who are, I think, people who know all the different sides and can, you know, and could engage with that. And I'm very, actually, I believe that this could be a way where we could at least try to put the different sides together and you know, it's not going to be that one side is always going to win everything, but find compromises without any side losing their face. And this is something I've been hearing very often when I'm in the region, that people say, we don't want people to come and talk to us in a way that that our population is going to think the West is dictating the Middle East what to do. It has to be, you know, we want to not lose our face. And I think that that's an important message, maybe.
That actually ties in with another topic that I had wanted to bring up in our conversation, which is whether either of you see an impact of demographic change in the region. And actually, one of our viewers has asked even a more pointed question in that regard. The viewer writes, just as Greta Thunberg has been a powerful voice on climate action, is there a youth movement or a youth leader that is calling for change in the Middle East? Could the next generation bring the kinds of change that we hope for? Do either of you have any thoughts on demographics in the region and what impact they might have, and whether sort of the next generation, and obviously the protests were driven 10 years ago by a lot of young people as well, but here we are 10 years later. Do you see any hope for change in that regard?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that question, because it allows me to unload a lot of my biases and prejudices and experiences. Jim Jeffries' first rule of anything in the diplomatic and international rule is never place all your hopes on any group of people based upon their birth, be it when they were born, what gender they were born into, what sexual preference they were born into, what ethnic group they were born into, or what religious community they were born into. It will, in the end, disappoint you. The only exception to this I'll make, and because it has been around for some time, but we haven't seen it kick in yet, is the demographic change that the population of the Arab world is growing older, because through the experiences it has had with modernity, women overall have over the last 30 years been having fewer children. And one impact of that is, as I said, an older population, which tends to be a less volatile population. That means less, mass protests against oppression. It also means fewer candidates to go join ISIS. So that may be a factor, but it's a partial deviation from my iron rule of never look to anybody's birth characteristics to determine either that person's or a whole group or country's future. I'll be cautious with that assertion.
Yeah, I would agree with Jim. Also, we should not forget, we had a lot of young people, as you mentioned, who went out and protested in Syria and Libya and other places. And now they lived through war, they lived through terrorism. When I was in Syria 1.5 years ago, some of the people I talked to said, we are exhausted, we are tired of war, we just want to go, we just want to have a day where we don't have to think about, if I go out I may not come back because or if my dad or my mother go out on the streets, they may not come back. And I think we have to just for a moment think about that. We live, we take security and safety for granted, but we are talking about people who for the past 10 years have not had a day where they felt they could sleep peacefully without thinking about what might happen tomorrow or not happen tomorrow. So I think I would say a lot of the people who are in the countries are very tired and just want to have some kind of solution. There are a few people, activists outside the countries who are still trying to mix in, but I think overall it's at the moment people just want to end the crisis and the wars.
So as we start to wind up, I want to fold in one more viewer question and then ask each of you a closing question. And I guess it is not a surprise that the reverberations of the Arab Spring, or the events known as the Arab Spring, have been felt far beyond the region as well. And both of you have touched on that a little bit. You touched, Jim, on migration, and I think there's a sense of anti-immigrant populism that has grown in the West, partly because of that migration trend. The Arab Spring probably played a role in the turn toward increasing repression in China as well, as Chinese leaders were watching what was happening in the Middle East. But one of our viewers poses the following question: to what extent has interference led to instability and made Europe and the US more susceptible to terrorism? And I think that ties in with the questions that we were asking about interference from the outside in the region. How much of a factor has that been in radicalizing people? Jim, yeah.
I'll take the first plunge with 2003. The Bush administration clearly scrambled the entire Middle East by going into Iraq. It undid a very cynical but still effective balance between Iran and the numerically and economically stronger but politically weaker Sunni Arab states. It soaked up much of the bandwidth of American foreign policy for the better part of a decade, and it really was a disaster. Now, I'm less sure of our reaction to 9/11, apart from Iraq, which to some degree was a reaction to 9/11, and the Obama reaction to the Arab Spring. I think both were flawed as foreign policy. I'm not so sure they had anything like the same dramatically awful results in the Middle East that the 2003 intervention did. They didn't help the Middle East, neither our counterterrorism campaign all that much, and certainly not Obama's approach to the Arab Spring. But I don't think you can blame them, those actions, for much of what happened. I think the one area where I would say, boy, it was a major dramatic deterioration of the region was our going into Iraq in 2003. As one of the people who was not supporting it, but involved in picking up the pieces a few months later, I know of what I speak.
Yeah, let me take a step back here for a moment. It's interesting when we speak about the region very often. We speak about the Sunnis, the Shia, the Alawites. Since you mentioned Iraq 2003, I was actually there. I was one of the youngest reporters on the ground back then for the Post, and until 2004 as well. And it was very interesting coming from having a sushi background, as we say. My dad is Sunni, my mom is Shia. And I never had to deal with all of this until I went to Iraq. And suddenly every media outlet started talking about Saddam Hussein, the Sunni leader, and then the Shia population and all of that. And at some stage, the more time I spent in Iraq, I realized one thing, and I don't know, Jim, if this is something maybe you want to discuss as well, but under Saddam Hussein, it didn't matter if you were Sunni, Shia, Christian, or whatever. It mattered what mattered to him was were you a Ba'athist or not, or were you part of the opposition? And there were also Sunni opposition members, as we all know. There were, his own the son-in-laws who then disappeared. So sometimes I believe, due all respect, when we look at the region, we very often look at it from, okay, what religious group is this now? And who's the ruler and who's that? It's sometimes a little bit more complex and complicated. I have seen that a woman who was Aqila al-Hashimi, who was actually a part of the Ba'athist movement and who was supposed to also play a role after the fall of Saddam Hussein, was killed by radical Shia militias because they didn't like her approach. So it's not like, black and white. It's not as black and white as we see it. And what I sometimes feel is when we talk about interference, the interference begins also in the language that we use when we look at the region and when we analyze the conflicts. And it's a bit too easy to say this person is an Alawite and therefore the majority is Sunni and he's oppressing the Sunnis, because believe it or not, a few people who were close to Assad were also Sunnis. The same time in Bahrain, for example, when we say the ruler is Sunni and the majority is Shia, what are we saying here? What are we really saying here? It's a little bit like, would we want to have our countries be seen in this way? President Obama was an African American and therefore he should, we have to start with how we look at those countries and what language we use. I think I would urge a little bit, to be a bit more careful about that. And this is one point where I believe we unfortunately got it sometimes, or are getting it sometimes wrong. That's one point. The other thing is, I believe that foreign interference did play a role in the escalation in some of those countries. We mentioned Syria, we mentioned Libya, and we are seeing it on the ground. We are seeing different armies, different militias fighting on one side or the other, and it's going to be very, very difficult to find a solution for Libya or Syria, and if we are not finding a way to get all these foreign players out of the country. Just to give you one last point, can you imagine that at the moment you have two powers, you have Russia and Turkey, flying in Syrian mercenaries to Libya, who are fighting in Libya against one another? This is where we are. And it's so, yes, foreign interference did play a role in the escalation. Absolutely.
So we're just about out of time, but rather than end on that somewhat pessimistic note, let me pose a question that may or may not lead to a more optimistic response from either of you, but might also lead to more pessimism. And that is, here we are today, 10 years later, and I wonder for each of you, are there any lessons that can be drawn from the events that unfolded a decade ago? Or were the protests and uprisings that took place as part of the Arab Spring in vain?
Nothing in history is in vain. It is a process that is either going in a circle, the Greeks, or towards some wonderful end, the Judeo-Christian alternative, but it certainly is moving in some direction, and I don't think you can take an attitude of, well, something was in vain. We learned from the last 20 years the limits of our ability to make fundamental change. we've also learned, and I think the people of the region have learned, and Libya, not in 2011 when NATO went in, but the second phase of foreign intervention in Libya with Emiratis and Egyptians and Turks and Russians and a bit of French indicates that even without the US and its Western pals, the usual heavies in anything that goes wrong in the region, getting involved, bad things can happen and get ever worse. That's another thing that everybody needs to learn, because it opens the door to a more realistic engagement with the United States, again, if we can be lashed up to our Western European partners who are much more affected by what will happen in the Middle East, and we take a different attitude towards and listen more to the people of the region.
Thank you, Jim. The last word goes to you, Souad.
Well, I know we were a little pessimistic here, or maybe some people might feel this way, but I think if people have learned a lesson, it's also that you may want to sometimes listen to the people who do not give you the rosy picture and who do not just say it's all going to end well, and who might actually also have a different approach of finding solutions with the region together. But the other thing is also, I'm not sure we would have seen the kind of new coalition between some of the Arab countries and Israel if it wasn't for some of what happened during the Arab Spring, believe it or not. But I think it probably played a role also in pushing this kind of new coalition. Of course, the role Iran plays a role in that too. But I'm also optimistic when I see the role of women in some of those countries. I think that women are going to play a much bigger role in the future. And I see Jim is unmuting, so that's just so yeah. Maybe
he'll remind us of his rule.
She's violating my rule of never place hope on anybody based upon the details of that person's birth. Okay.
I know I was trying to unmute you, that's all. But yeah, I think we may be able, because there is a momentum, and I hope that people understand this, to bring people together, because people are tired of the current situation. And it's the decision the Biden administration will have to make if they want to play a role in this, or if they don't want to play a role in this. And if they don't want to play a role in this, then the result might be that Russia and China will play a much bigger role in the Middle East than they have had before.
Well, Souad and Jim, I want to thank you both for this deeply nuanced conversation. I've enjoyed seeing you both and having this exchange. My only regret is that we were not able to do it in person, but hopefully before all too long, that will be possible. Until then, I hope you both stay well, and I look forward to staying in touch with both of you. I also want to thank our viewers for tuning in today, and let everybody know that on Friday, we'll actually be having a discussion dedicated to the future of the Iran nuclear deal, a topic which came up today on the periphery, one that definitely plays a role in the region. But thank you again to both of you for joining us today.